for Jung, the hero's journey was the journey inside the unconscious, and that would be perhaps in some sense that the willingness to face everything terrible that's happened to you and to think it through and to articulate it and to come to grips perhaps with your own capacity for malevolence. That was a really important part of Jungian ideas, that the first step towards individuation, which is the manifestation of your full self, let's say, was the discovery of your shadow. And your shadow is the part of you that will do terrible things under the right circumstances, and maybe even without that much provocation. And you know, and it's a terrifying part of you to come into contact with, because it's sort of the way that you're specifically attached to the archetype of evil. That's a good way of thinking about it. And you know, modern people, they don't really think much about the idea of good and evil, but that's because most of them are so damn naive, you can just barely even comprehend it. You know, if you read any history, if you really read it, like, and you don't come away with the idea that evil exists, it's like you're just reading the wrong kind of history, you know. It's just unbelievable what people can do to each other. And we're so imaginative, you know. And one of the things I figured out about people, the reason that we have the knowledge of good and evil, let's say, is that because we're self-conscious and we know about ourselves, we know about our own vulnerability, right? You know what hurts you. You really know what hurts you, way more than an animal knows. And you're also creative, and so once you know what hurts you, man, you can really hurt someone else. And you can do it in such a creative way. You can draw it out. You can make it excruciating. You can take people apart physically and psychologically. And you can keep them, say, even right on the edge of death, so that you can keep doing that endlessly. And, you know, that happens. Hell of a lot more than you think it happens. It happens a lot. And so, well, and you think, well, you know, that doesn't involve me. It's like, oh, yes, it does, man. That's the problem, because you know, you're human, and that's the sort of things that human beings are capable of. And I'm not saying it's all probable that you do that ever, or that, but I'm saying that, you know, you got to take that into account. When you're looking at the world and you think about all the perpetrators out there, it's not like there's perpetrators and there's victims. That isn't how it works. It doesn't work that way at all. And so the horrors of humanity, as well as the noble elements of humanity, are all elements of your central being. And for Jung, and this is the terrible thing, for Jung, the pathway to higher wisdom was through the terrible portal of, well, you could say hell, for that matter. Really. And so who wants to do that, man? It's like, no, like maybe you're resentful about something. Well, you probably are, because like everybody's resentful about something, you know. And resentment is just a vicious emotion. It's really useful. It's really useful, because if you're resentful about something, it either means that you should grow the hell up and accept the responsibility and quit sniveling around and whining, or it means that someone actually is oppressing you and pushing on you too hard and bullying you and demeaning you, and you have something to say or do that you're not saying or doing. And no wonder you're not saying or doing it, because, you know, it can be really dangerous to say things or do them to free yourself from being oppressed. You can get in a lot of trouble in the short term for doing it. So it's easier just to not say anything, sort of day after day. In the short term, you protect yourself, but it just crushes you. And then the resentment comes up, and resentment, man, that can just get so out of hand, you know. It starts with resentment, and then it goes to the desire for revenge, you know, because you'll play nasty little tricks on the person that's oppressing you. At any chance, you'll talk about them behind their back, and if they want you to do something, you'll do it badly, or you'll do it grudgingly, or you'll do a half-rate job, and you'll set up little traps, and, you know, so it puts you in a poisonous space. And then if you really start to dwell on that, say, in your basement for 3 or 4 years about just exactly how terrible the world is and how that's focused on you and how everyone's rejected you, and how you get to this point where you're thinking that, you know, existence itself is a kind of poisonous endeavor, and that the best thing for you to do is go out there and do as much, you know, create as much mayhem as you possibly can. And if you really get to a dark place, you think, I'm going to create as much mayhem as I possibly can by targeting the most innocent thing I can possibly imagine. And then you end up shooting kids in Connecticut. And that's how you get there. And so that's a bad road, man. There's dark things down there. But you can go there, and people do. And they go through the hole of resentment. And so resentment can tell you, you've got something to say. You bloody well better say it. You gotta free yourself from what's oppressing you. You have to stand up for that, because otherwise you become oppressed, and then once you're oppressed, that's just not so good. And so, like in your marriage and your relationships, you got to tell people what you're thinking. You don't have to assume you're right. That's a whole different story, because you're not, because you're, ignorant and you're biased, and, so you're not right, but you can stumble towards the expression of yourself, and then you can listen to the other person and hope that they tell you some way that you're stupid that's useful, so you can be a little less stupid in the future, because wouldn't that be good? And so, you go after the unknown. You don't protect what you know. You already know what you know. You go after what you don't know. That's why you have to talk to people you don't agree with. That's why you have to talk to your enemies, because they're going to tell you things you don't know. You could even listen to them. It's possible they know a thing or two you don't know. But people don't like that, They just talk to people who think the same way, and then they just stay stupid. And so that's not good, because if you're not wise, the world will wallop you, will flatten you, and far more than it has to. And then you'll be bitter and resentful, and you'll be part of that force that wallops instead of the force that fights against that. Something about the natural ethical order of things has been seriously violated. And there's a strong intimation in the Old Testament, which I think, by the way, is completely correct, that if the proper order of being is violated, and that's something like the balance between chaos and order, say, if the proper balance of being is violated, then all hell will break loose. And one of the things I can tell you from reading a very comprehensive set of myths from around the world is that that's a conclusion that human beings have come to everywhere. Stay on the goddamn path and be careful. Because if you start to mess around and you deviate, especially if you know that you're deviating, things are not going to go well for you. And that idea is everywhere. And I think it's right. I think the idea is right, because there aren't that many ways of doing things right, and there's a lot of ways of doing things wrong. And if you do things wrong, the consequences of doing them wrong can be truly catastrophic. One of the things I learned from reading Viktor Frankl first, but then Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who I think did a deeper job, was that, and Václav Havel thought the same thing, that these people were very much trying to understand what happened in places like Nazi Germany and in the Soviet Union. Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago is a particularly good analysis of what happened in the Soviet Union. And his conclusion, and it's a 2,100-page conclusion, and it's like hammered home with a hammer. It's a book that everyone should read, assuming that you can read a 2,100-page scream, because that's basically what it is. First of all, what he does is document just how terrible things were in the Soviet Union between 1919 and 1959. And no matter how terrible you think they were, unless you know the stories, they were a lot more terrible than that. And they were terrible personally, because everyone lied. They were terrible in families, because 2 out of 5 people were government informers. They were terrible among friends, because no one could tell each other the truth. They were terrible socially, because the whole system was corrupt. It ran on slave labor. And they were terrible philosophically, because the doctrine of man upon which the state was founded was hopeless and nihilistic. And they were murderous, destructive, and genocidal. It's like they got it wrong at every single level of analysis simultaneously. And the question is, why? And Solzhenitsyn's answer, and to some degree Viktor Frankl's answer as well, and Václav Havel, and I would say also Nelson Mandela and Gandhi, they all ended up in the same conceptual sphere. And the answer was because individual people lived crooked lives. Because individual people swallowed lies and spoke them and didn't stand up for the truth. And the corruption that spread from each individual pulled the entire state mechanism into that corruption and made everything into hell. There are other theories. Obedience, right? That's kind of the Milgram idea from that it's easy to make human beings obedient to people in authority. And I've explored that idea quite a bit with regards to what happened, for example, in the Nazi concentration camps. And yes, you can set circumstances up so that people are likely to be obedient to orders that are pathological. There's no doubt about that. And yes, sometimes that's indicative of the weakness of their character, but that's not the issue. And the idea that what happened in Nazi Germany was because a population of good people listened to a tiny minority of bad people, that's really not a good theory. The Nazi ethos was there at every single level of the social organization, right? Right from the familial, all the way up to the leadership. It was the same thing all the way up and all the way down. And the same thing in the Soviet Union. And so, if you miss the mark, which is apparently what the people of Sodom and Gomorrah did, their sin was grievous, then they risked destruction. And I just cannot see how, after the 20th century, anybody with any sense could possibly not see that as true. And I think that there's a line in the Old Testament, that the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. And I can tell you one of the things that frightened me badly was the realization from reading Solzhenitsyn and a variety of other things that I was reading at the same time, that Dostoevsky as well, because he makes the same point. He said that a human being is not only responsible for everything they do, but for everything that everyone else does. Now, that's crazy, and he was an epileptic and a mystic, and that's a crazy thing to say. But it's also, there's something about it that's true, because if you were better, the people around you would be less worse than they are. And if you were good enough, you don't know how much better the people around you would be. And so, there's this idea too, that Christ took the sins of the world unto himself. That's a complicated idea, man. I wrestled with that one for a very long time, but I think I figured out, at least in part, what it means. It meant that it's something like the realization of complete humanity. You see, to take the sins of the world onto yourself is to realize that, is to understand the Nazi concentration camp guard. Because that person is human, and so are you. And so if you can't see you in that, then you don't know who you are. And if you can see you in that, well, then you've started to take the sins of the world onto yourself, because you've actually started to take responsibility for those terrible things. I think it's the motif of the motto of the Holocaust Museum in Washington. We must never forget. That's close. And I think, well, you can't forget. You can't remember what you don't understand. You will forget what you don't understand. And the question is, well, what are you supposed to remember about the Holocaust? It was a historical event, that 6 million people died. That's not what's to remember. What's to remember is that's what people can do. And you're one of them. And if you don't understand that you could do that, then you don't know who you are.